On the night of April 7, 1953, a crane moved through the darkness at Fort Yates, North Dakota. By morning, Sitting Bull's grave was empty. His remains were across the state line in South Dakota, and no one at Standing Rock had been asked. That is not a historical footnote. That is an open case. The question this file is investigating: where exactly are Sitting Bull's remains right now? Not where the monument says they are, where they actually are. Because after 70 years, that answer is still disputed and still unverified by the people who have the most right to know. We are going to work through this the way a forensic investigator would. We examined the original burial in 1890. We examined the unauthorized removal in 1953. We examine what the DNA evidence does and does not tell us. And we hold what remains unresolved, because the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe is still holding it too. Let's build the board. The man buried at Fort Yates in December of 1890 was not only a war chief. That framing war chief strips half of who he was. Tatanka Iyotanka, known to the world as Sitting Bull, was first and above all a Wichasha Wakan. That is a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, a person whose authority came from spiritual vision and from the trust of his community, not from military rank. Historian Robert Utley, writing in The Lance and the Shield in 1993, is explicit on this point. His power was not the power of command. It was the power of vision. That distinction matters for this investigation because it explains what his death and burial meant to his community. For the Hunkpapa Lakota, the proper burial of the dead is not sentiment, it is sacred obligation. It is connected to the continuity of community and to the spirit's journey obligations that do not expire. When Sitting Bull was killed on December 15, 1890, those obligations were violated immediately. Here is what the scene at the Grand River looked like. Indian agent James McLaughlin had spent weeks lobbying Washington to have Sitting Bull removed or arrested. McLaughlin feared that Sitting Bull's involvement in the Ghost Dance movement would trigger an uprising. On the morning of December 15th, McLaughlin sent 43 Hunkpapa Lakota police officers to Sitting Bull's cabin. 43 officers, roughly the size of a single city police precinct's night shift, sent to arrest one 59-year-old man at his home. What followed was a confrontation that killed 14 people. 6 police officers died. 7 of Sitting Bull's supporters died. Sitting Bull himself was killed. 14 casualties in a single pre-dawn arrest, more than in many full engagements of the Indian Wars. And then there was the horse. Buffalo Bill Cody had given Sitting Bull a gray circus horse during his time touring with the Wild West show in 1885. As the gunfire erupted outside the cabin, that horse heard the chaos and began performing its show routine, lifting its legs in sequence, bowing its head, circling. The horse was doing what it had been trained to do: perform. Eyewitnesses on both sides of the fight recorded it. The animal danced while its owner lay dying. That image compresses the shape of what had been done to Sitting Bull's life into a single frame. A Hunkpapa holy man who had toured American cities performing a version of his own people's defeat for paying crowds, who had earned roughly $50 a week, doing it equivalent to about $1,700 a week today, who had used that money to give to homeless children he encountered on those tours, and who was now dying while the horse remembered the show. That horse is evidence of what had been done to Sitting Bull's life before anyone touched his grave. His burial 2 days later, on December 17th, was not conducted by his community. He was buried at Fort Yates in a military-administered grave on land controlled by the United States government. Hunkpapa Lakota community members were not permitted to conduct traditional burial ceremonies. Not permitted. The first violation of Sitting Bull's remains was not in 1953. It was in 1890, when the Army buried him before his people could. Now we have the original gravesite on our board: Fort Yates, North Dakota. December 17th, 1890. A military plot, no traditional ceremony. A community excluded from burying their own holy man. That is the starting point of this cold case. But what came next? Nobody teaches this. Before we get to 1953, the file requires context on what Sitting Bull had already survived. In 1881, after years of exile in Canada following the events at Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull surrendered at Fort Beaufort, Montana Territory. The date was July 20, 1881. The U.S. Army officer receiving the surrender expected a weapon handed over. Sitting Bull handed his rifle to his young son, Crowfoot, and he had Crowfoot walk forward and place the rifle in the officer's hands. Then Sitting Bull spoke, in Lakota, and the interpreter translated. His words were recorded. They appear in Army documents and in Utley's biography. I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle. He did not hand the rifle over. He engineered the meaning of his own surrender. The Army recorded it. He had controlled the narrative even in defeat. The last man, his words, still in the record. By 1889, Sitting Bull was living on the Standing Rock Reservation under the supervision of Agent McLaughlin. That year, the United States passed the Sioux Act of 1889. The act broke up the Great Sioux Reservation into 6 smaller reservations and transferred approximately 11 million acres to the U.S. government. 11 million acres, an area larger than the entire states of Maryland and Delaware combined. Sitting Bull actively organized opposition to the act among Hunkpapa communities. He refused to sign. McLaughlin documented the resistance in official correspondence to Washington, describing Sitting Bull as an obstacle. That correspondence is now in the National Archives. It is part of this case file. By 1890, when the ghost dance movement spread across the plains, McLaughlin identified Sitting Bull as the man most likely to give that movement political power. His solution was arrest. The arrest became a killing, and the killing became a burial that denied his community their sacred obligations. We have established the first crime scene on the board, Fort Yates, North Dakota, December 1890. Now we move the timeline forward 63 years, and the case gets stranger. April 7, 1953, Fort Yates, North Dakota, nighttime. A group of Mobridge, South Dakota civic leaders had organized what they called a reburial. They had recruited Clarence Gray Eagle, a nephew of Sitting Bull, to provide family authorization. They excavated the grave at Fort Yates, loaded the remains, and drove south across the state line into South Dakota before dawn. The remains were reburied on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River near Mobridge. The new grave was secured with concrete and topped with a large granite bust monument commissioned by the state of South Dakota. The operation was complete before Standing Rock was notified. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe was not consulted. A tribal council vote was never held. No federal permit was sought. No consultation, no vote, no permit. Now, examine the authorization question because this is where the case fractures. Clarence Gray Eagle was Sitting Bull's nephew. That is documented. But the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's position, documented in tribal statements and in press reporting across multiple decades, is direct. Clarence Gray Eagle did not have tribal authority to authorize a reburial. Individual family members do not hold sovereignty over decisions that belong to the tribal nation. That distinction between personal, family connection and tribal political authority is not a technicality. It is the entire structure of how sovereign nations make decisions about their own dead. Consider what this situation actually was. A break-in, at night, the occupants taken without consent, then a monument placed on the lawn, and when the family objected, they were told the concrete was already set and the law wasn't sure it covered this. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe is still waiting for someone to acknowledge the door was forced. The Mobridge civic leaders had a clear motivation. A monument to Sitting Bull on a bluff above the Missouri River would draw tourism. It would put Mobridge, South Dakota on the map in a way that Fort Yates, North Dakota would no longer be. The granite bust is large, visible from a distance, and has served as a tourist landmark for decades. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's position, documented in their public statements, is specific. They view the monument as the commercialization of a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man's memory without tribal consent. Not a tribute, a use. Now here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. The central forensic problem of this case is one most people do not know exists. As of the most recent publicly reported scientific review, no DNA testing has definitively confirmed that the remains in the Mobridge grave are Sitting Bull's. That is not an interpretation. It is the documented state of the evidence. The source is a New York Times report by James Brooke, published March 27, 1997, reporting on a request the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe had formally submitted the prior year. In 1996, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe formally requested DNA testing of both the Mobridge remains and material from the original Fort Yates site. The request was made through proper legal and scientific channels. Mobridge officials and members of the Gray Eagle family resisted independent forensic testing, and that resistance has never been formally explained. If the identification was certain, the evidence would answer the question. It has not been allowed to. The original Fort Yates burial site had been significantly disturbed by the time forensic interest developed. The 1953 removal was conducted at night, with a crane, by civic boosters, under time pressure, not as a careful archaeological excavation. The chain of custody for those remains from the Fort Yates grave to the Mobridge reburial site was never formally documented in the way forensic science requires. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe repeated their DNA testing request in subsequent years. As of 2025, definitive forensic confirmation has not been publicly established. That means the Mobridge monument, the granite bust, the tourist site, the state-commissioned landmark may not even mark the right man. The grave marker could be a monument to an unverified identification made in the dark, in April, 62 years after the original burial. Now place the legal question on the board. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, was enacted in 1990. NAGPRA requires federal institutions to return Native American remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribal nations. It is the primary legal mechanism that should, in a functioning system, resolve exactly this kind of dispute. But here is the gap in this case. The remains were moved in 1953, 37 years before NAGPRA existed. They are currently on private or state-managed land, not in a federal institution's collection. NAGPRA's jurisdiction does not straightforwardly reach them. The law designed to resolve this kind of violation does not cleanly apply to this specific case. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe is caught in a legal gap, a removal that happened before the law existed, and a law that does not cover where the remains currently sit. That is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. That is a designed outcome, whether or not anyone designed it consciously. The concrete was poured against the objection before the objection was formally made. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. Let us now place the present on the board. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has a current enrollment of approximately 15,000 members. The reservation straddles North and South Dakota. The tribe includes Hunkpapa and Hunkpapa Lakota and Dakota people. They are the direct, living, political, and cultural descendants of Sitting Bull's community. Their claim is not archival. It is not historical in the sense of being closed. It is active and ongoing as of 2025. In 2016 and 2017, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe gained international attention during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. People around the world learned that Standing Rock existed, that it asserted sovereignty, that it fought for its land and its water. The protest camp was called Oseti Sakowin, the name of the Council of the Seven Fires of the Lakota and Dakota peoples. What most of that international audience did not know is that this same tribe had been formally requesting the return of their holy man's verified remains for decades. The pipeline fight and the grave dispute are not separate stories. They are the same story, about the same nation, asserting the same sovereignty over the same land. The question of where Sitting Bull is buried is not a curiosity for documentary viewers. It is a living question for a living nation. Now let's examine what the caseboard actually shows us in total. December 17, 1890, Sitting Bull buried at Fort Yates without traditional ceremony, the first violation. April 7, 1953, remains removed at night, without tribal authorization, relocated across a state line, the second violation. 1990. NAGPRA enacted. But the gap in jurisdiction means it does not cleanly resolve this dispute. 1996 and after. DNA testing formally requested by Standing Rock, resisted by Mobridge and the Gray Eagle family. 2025. No verified forensic confirmation. The claim on the Mobridge monument is unproven. That is the case file. Every item on that board represents a decision made by someone with power over someone without it. And every item on that board has a living community on the other side of it. There is one more detail the file requires before we close. Return to December 15, 1890, not to the killing, but to the moment after. Sitting Bull lay on the ground outside his cabin on the Grand River. The gray horse was still moving in its trained circle, lifting its legs, performing. The horse did not know that the show was over. It only knew its routine. That image, a trained animal performing a show while its owner lay on the cold ground, contains the entire shape of what was done to Sitting Bull's life. He had been recruited into a performance, managed, surveilled, restricted, and finally killed for refusing to stop being who he was. And the instrument of his reduction, the show horse, the symbol of his years as a spectacle for American audiences, kept moving anyway. He had tried to control the meaning of everything they did to him. When he surrendered his rifle at Fort Buford in 1881, he handed it to his son, so that the act would be remembered as something he chose. I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle. He made the Army record his own words about his own defeat. He understood that the record was the only thing left to control. And now, 135 years after his death, the record still has a hole in it. The remains on the Mobridge Bluff have not been verified by independent DNA analysis. The tribe that has every right to know, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, 15,000 members strong, a sovereign nation, is still waiting. The granite bust faces the Missouri River. Tourists photograph it. South Dakota commissioned it. South Dakota benefits from it. The Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, whose image it carries, was buried without their ceremony, moved without their consent, and memorialized without their approval. That is not history. That is current events. Cold cases stay cold when the people with the evidence have no reason to open them. The DNA testing has been requested. It has been resisted. That resistance has never been formally explained. A verified forensic analysis of the Mobridge remains, conducted with the full participation and consent of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, would take months. It has not happened. As of this recording, it has not happened. If you have followed true crime long enough, you know what it means when the party holding the evidence refuses independent testing. You know what it means when the people asking the questions are told the case is closed when no verdict was ever rendered. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe is not asking for sentiment. They are asking for forensic verification of their own ancestors' remains. That is the simplest possible ask. It has gone unanswered for nearly 30 years since the formal 1996 request. The gray horse has long since stopped dancing, but the circle it traced that morning, that cold December morning in 1890, outside the cabin on the Grand River, that circle has not closed. If you want to support the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's ongoing sovereignty claims and cultural preservation work, their official tribal website is standingrock.org. The NAGPRA documentation process that could apply pressure on this case is managed through the National Park Service. Public comments and federal oversight inquiries are open to anyone. If you found this investigation useful, the next file in this series examines another unresolved question in Hunkpapa Lakota history that the monument industry has no interest in answering. Subscribe so it finds you when it posts. The file on Sitting Bull is not closed. It is waiting for someone with a DNA lab and the courage to open it. Standing Rock has been waiting since 1890. The least the record can do is say that plainly and keep saying it until someone picks up the phone and orders the test. Standing Rock has been waiting since 1890. The least the record can do is say that plainly and keep saying it until someone picks up the phone and orders the test. The granite bust faces the Missouri River. Tourists photograph it. South Dakota commissioned it. South Dakota benefits from it. The Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, whose image it carries, was buried without their ceremony, moved without their consent, and memorialized without their approval. That is not history. That is current events. Cold cases stay cold when the people with the evidence have no reason to open them. The DNA testing has been requested. It has been resisted. That resistance has never been formally explained. A verified forensic analysis of the Mobridge remains, conducted with the full participation and consent of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, If you want to support the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's ongoing sovereignty claims and cultural preservation work, their official tribal website is standingrock.org. The NAGPRA documentation process that could apply pressure on this case is managed through the National Park Service.